China stands ready to work with other members of the international community to build a world free from want and a world of development and dignity.
Chinese Premier Li Keqiang stresses the importance of sustainable development in his speech to the United Nations. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. In his address to the United Nations General Assembly, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang spoke about China's vision for global development. The Chinese Premier said only development can guarantee fundamental rights and advance civilization and progress. Urging the United Nations Charter be upheld, Premier Li called for support of the organization's lead role in the Syrian civil war and refugee crisis. He also advocated for denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula. CCTV's Nathan King begins our coverage now from the United Nations. And Nathan, Premier Li covered a lot of ground in his speech. Tell us about China's Sustainable Development Plan.
Yeah, let's put it in context. The Sustainable Development Agenda is the theme of the General Assembly. Ambitious goals for the world up to 2030. All economies rising together, a more equitable distribution, and also a greener and safer planet as well. And Li Keqiang began his speech to world leaders here from the General Assembly by saying that China has already got a national plan. It's implementing it. It actually fits China's growth model in terms of pulling the remaining tens of millions of people out of poverty in China and creating 14 million new urban jobs as well. And he reassured the audience that the best way of doing that is continuing with China's economic plan, which is continue reforms and, of course, opening up. Let's take a listen.
We will promote development through expanding opening up. China's experience in past decades has proven that a closed-door policy only leads to stagnation and backwardness, and opening up brings development and prosperity. China will be firm in pursuing the win-win strategy of opening up. China will open its doors even wider to the outside world.
And Premier Li Keqiang basically warning the world leaders against protectionism, basically saying that globalization in the end lifts all countries together. You know, there's a big unity about the development goals here at the United Nations, but the reality on the ground in 2016 is we are seeing more protectionism, less trade, more regionalism, divides between East and West, North and South. So it's a timely speech. Whether the world will actually implement all this in 2030 remains to be seen.
Nathan, China's pledged $300 million in humanitarian aid for the refugee and the migrant crisis. What is China's position on Syria?
Well, I mean, obviously, let's take the migrants first. First of all, they pledged $100 million and then $50 million increments to help migrants and refugees. Remember, of course, China has a lot of experience with migration internally, of people coming from the countryside into the towns, tens of millions. On terms of Syria, it really has overshadowed this UN General Assembly. We've seen the finger-pointing between Russia and China about the attacks on the Syrian army and the attack on that aid convoy as well, and it fell to China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi in the Security Council debate we had earlier this week to remind everyone that the process should be a diplomatic one led by the Syrian people themselves, and urged everyone to get back on track on this Geneva process, which of course, as you know, has been stalling for the last few years, but only by dialogue and the Syrian people and parties leading it themselves is the Chinese position. Can there be an end to the civil war, not imposed by powers from outside?
Thanks, Nathan. That's CCTV's Nathan King reporting from New York. Joining us now from New York is Kevin Rudd. He's the former Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Australia. Mr. Rudd is also the chair of the Independent Commission on Multilateralism and recently completed an extensive report on the United Nations titled UN 2030, Rebuilding Order in a Fragmenting World. Mr. Rudd, thanks for joining us.
Good to be with you.
Let's start with that report. Your core argument is that the UN matters, but that vital reforms are necessary if it's to be relevant in the 21st century. What kinds of reforms are we talking about here?
I think the legitimacy of the United Nations is clear in the mind of the international community because we agreed back in 1945 that the world needed such an institution, and secondly, we agreed on what its governing values should be, and they are reflected in the UN Charter. But legitimacy also has another pillar. It's what I would describe as functional legitimacy, and that is an institution which is effective in global problem solving. And that's where the problem increasingly arises, because what we have found is that the ability of the United Nations system to solve effectively global problems on peace and security, sustainable development, humanitarian engagement and human rights is in fact slowly ebbing away. And instead what we see is governments around the world and nation states increasingly walking around the United Nations and finding their solutions elsewhere or not finding them at all. Over time, this creates a trend. And if people no longer come to the gatherings of the United Nations believing that this is the place to come to solve problems, but they simply come to it to, shall I say, deliver a diplomatic speech, then we're in trouble. So that, I believe, is the challenge we face.
Right, and the world is changing. The United Nations is now 70 years old. As you have pointed out, geopolitics and the international economic order has changed radically in that time period. So how important is global collaboration in this new century, in this new era?
Well, the dynamics of globalization are clear for us all. It affects China, it affects the rest of the world, it affects the United States, it affects Europe, it affects my own country, Australia. But the challenge is this: as the demands for more effective global governance increase, the institutions of global governance, in fact, have rarely been weaker. We find ourselves in this no man's land between, on the one hand, nation states, sovereign states, no longer capable of independently solving many of the problems they face because they are transnational. But on the other hand, we see our transnational or multilateral institutions not strong enough with sufficient empowerment to solve those problems as well. So we end up with the citizens of the world being dissatisfied both with national governments and with global institutions. And that creates a crisis of public confidence in the institutions of global governance and of national governance more generally.
Right, give us an example of that. Where has global governance failed?
Well, if we were to look at it plainly, let's look at the global asylum seekers, refugees and migration crisis. We created an institution in the 1950s called the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the UNHCR, and it was designed to prevent a repeat of the atrocities that we saw occur in the late 1930s when the world turned its back on the demands of global Jewish emigration from Europe. The result, of course, was the Holocaust. So we decided in the 1950s to create an institution so that that would be avoided in the future. But when we look at the most serious Syrian refugees crisis, for example, and the outflow of refugees not just from Syria, but from Iraq, from Syria and the surrounding countries now, of Jordan and of Lebanon and of Turkey, and more broadly across Libya and North Africa, we see a system not able to cope with the demands of the pressures which now exist, either in source countries and stabilizing them, secondly in neighboring countries where people flee to in order to escape physical threat, thirdly in terms of transit countries as they seek to make their way elsewhere, and finally in terms of enough burden sharing across destination countries so that you've got a system whereby if people are seeking to flee from trouble spots around the world, that there are enough countries prepared to share the burden of being countries of final destination. That system, that global system, is now effectively broken.
Okay, talking about countries sharing the burden, let's take a listen to what the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang had to say about the refugee crisis. He was addressing the UN General Assembly. Let's watch.
As we speak, the world is facing the largest refugee crisis since World War II. It is imperative to ensure access to basic living conditions by the refugees to stave off a humanitarian crisis. A more fundamental solution lies in rooting out the causes of warfare and renewed development so that source countries can be on a path towards enduring peace, development, and prosperity.
So though we have China speaking at the UN, China has also pledged $300 million in humanitarian assistance. This is one country, but are you encouraged by China's willingness to provide help?
Well, yes, I think Premier Li Keqiang's response there is good at two levels. He's recognising the fundamental causative factors, which is either poverty or insecurity within countries. Obviously, Syria and Iraq are the most current examples of that. And unless we deal with those underlying causes for people exiting, then we're just applying band-aids. But secondly, when people do exit, then we've got to have those band-aids ready. And I think what's welcome is the fact that China is now stumping up. China is now putting its hand in its pocket to contribute to global operations such as those through the UNHCR, through the World Food Programme, through UNICEF. In other words, the critical UN agencies designed to help people who find themselves in absolute disaster. So I think this is a good forward step by China, and consistent with what I've seen in recent times, with China, for example, increasing its efforts in global peacekeeping operations, with China now being one of the larger contributors to global UN peacekeeping operations around the world. So these are good steps on the part of the Chinese government.
Well, in addition to the refugee crisis, which was spawned by the Syrian crisis, we see the devastation, the loss of human life in Syria itself. We've just seen a UN convoy, an aid convoy, being bombed in that country. Are you confident that the UN can play a role in facilitating a ceasefire that will last in this country and ultimately bringing peace to this country?
Well, firstly, on the bombing of the humanitarian convoy, it basically tears at the hearts of all global citizens to see those who are peacemakers, those trying to deliver physical aid to those who are suffering, dying, and who are injured, that those peacemakers themselves, those humanitarian workers, blown to pieces by this appalling attack. The second point I'd say is that in response to your question about the UN's broader role, here's the challenge we face as an international community. Number one, this war's been going on for more than 5 years. We have hundreds of thousands of dead. We have the destruction of a national economy. We have the exit of millions of refugees into neighbouring countries and then further afield. And it becomes almost a signpost, a banner of the UN's ineffectiveness in an environment such as this. So therefore, what's the practical challenge? For the Security Council to be able to, through its member states, to enforce an effective ceasefire. And secondly, in reality, not just in declaration, providing for humanitarian corridors which get the aid through. But 5 years later, the UN's credibility is really, shall I say, under question. And we therefore must resolve on the basis of this most recent horrific attack to get the job done.
Have we not seen some success, though, let's say, in the Paris Agreement on climate change? The Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon, announced just this week that 60 countries have now signed on to that deal. How significant is that?
Well, yes, I think when we look at the United Nations, it's always whether the cup is half full or half empty. What we've been talking about is the extent to which the cup might be half empty on questions of peace and security in Syria, and secondly, on the global asylum seekers and refugees flows and the inability of the system to cope. But when we look at the cup half full, certainly the Paris Accord on climate change is one of those great steps forward. But now we're faced with the really difficult challenge of implementation, not just to the Paris Accord on climate change, but more broadly on the Sustainable Development Goals, which were agreed here at the United Nations in New York last September. Establishing these normative frameworks is good. Having national commitments of action is good. But you know something? The planet doesn't lie. And therefore, unless these are translated into reality and greenhouse gas emissions actually come down, and come down rapidly enough to avoid temperature increases in excess of 2 degrees centigrade, then all of us, every citizen in the world, will pay the price. So what's the challenge? For the UN, the World Bank, and frankly global private finance to combine together to provide the financial capacity to bring about the renewable energy revolution, the increases in energy efficiency in order to bring about real, measurable, sustained reductions in greenhouse gas emissions on the ground. The planet, as I said before, does not lie.
Kevin Rudd, great to have you on the show. Thanks for your time, sir.
Good to be back.
And we are going to take a break right now. Next, we'll hear from the president of Sierra Leone about his country's recovery after the Ebola crisis. Our coverage from the United Nations continues right after this.